Okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am pleased to introduce tonight's lecturer, a two-time graduate of Notre Dame, C.J. Howard. After receiving his Bachelor of Architecture and Master of Architectural Design and Urbanism degrees, C.J. became a registered architect, spending nearly 2 decades practicing in the Washington, D.C. area. He has extensive experience working for firms nationally known for their commitment to and expertise in classical and traditional design. He is also an assistant professor at the Catholic University of America, where he teaches in the newly launched Classical Traditional Architecture and Urbanism track. Mr. Howard has also recently been a lead project architect for McCreary Architects in DC, leading the design and construction of major ecclesiastical projects, as well as a variety of residential and civic projects, including several urban design projects in collaboration with the District Department of Transportation, proposing new visionary projects for our nation's capital. He has earned attention for his entries in design competitions, including a 2008 winning entry for a Contraband's and Freedmen's Cemetery Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia. His winning design, chosen from among several hundred entries submitted from around 20 countries, was used as the design framework for the memorial, which was completed and dedicated in 2014. Over the past few months, CJ has written 2 very thoughtful op-eds on the question of monuments: Theater of Memory, Confronting Confederate Memorials, and America Needs Civility and Civic Art Can Help. He is here today to discuss this important topic. Welcome back, CJ.
Thank you very much, Father Boleen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very exciting to be here. It's also an honor. Thank you, Dean Polyzoides, for your invitation. It's always good to be back to my alma mater, Go Irish. I can't see any of you, but I assume you're all raising your fists in the same manner. Without further ado, I'll get right into the presentation because time is always of the essence. And I'll just say, these Zoom presentations can be a little bit awkward. And, you know, it's hard to get a sense for the human beings behind the screen, so to speak. I actually had the thought that it would be kind of interesting to pump some crowd noise into a presentation like this, like what people are doing with sports events these days. You can't hear that accidental pencil drop or that phone going off. So maybe somebody can unmute and cough every once in a while, just to make sure there are human beings out there. At any rate, I'll move forward with the presentation. As Father Boleen said, I've recently been involved in ideas and other ways with monuments, and I think that's a big part of why I'm here today. So I'm excited at the opportunity to do that and to kind of take a step back and talk more broadly about the subjects of civic art, monuments, and memorials. And you'll see at the very beginning here, I have as a title, Commemorative Unity. That word really kept coming back to me and thinking about what to talk about for this lecture. The word itself kind of implies a sense of collectiveness, of the ability for people to come together in a way that involves art and architecture. So that part of it I sort of took hold of as a central theme to what I'm going to be talking about. Testing the delay on this. There we go. Okay. This first quote, I think you could take as a key to my premise, in that in things essential, unity; in things non-essential, diversity; in all things, charity. So again, going back to this point of commemoration, where if we can all agree on certain things as being essential, then that would go a long way towards the potential for unity. And then obviously we come from all different backgrounds and diversity. So that as being part of the picture as well. And that all of that under the calling to have charity. I thought what I would do, I appreciate Father Bellaine's introduction. I'd also like to tell you a little bit more about myself, not too much, but just to give you a sense of my narrative and where I'm coming from with this. In part, we're all formed by how we were raised or how we grew up. And I think this is helpful, at least it was helpful for me in understanding how to broach this subject with my own perspective. And so my background in growing up was coming up in a military family. I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Army, born in San Francisco, California, but I don't remember that at all. The first memories I have really were in Germany. That's where I spent most of my time at any given time, about 4 years. I was in Frankfurt, Germany, and Landstuhl, Germany. And you can see these images here just kind of showing some of the cultural aspects of those cultures, where they were very much public civic, really engaged in festivals that were commemorating certain events. The image on the bottom actually is a very fond, it's not my picture, but it's a fond memory of St. Martin's Tag, where they celebrate the St. Martin, and kids make these little lanterns and go out at night, and that's just completely emblazoned on my mind as a very memorable event growing up in that area. We also lived in Panama, the country of Panama, and Hawaii. Both of those cultures were very notable for their sort of public civic life, and I got to engage with that on some level. But my takeaway from both of those, from all of those cultures, was that there was an element, a dynamic element at play there, and that was definitely a high quality for any of those particular places, and one that I took away. And then I wanted to think specifically, just asking my own in my own memories, what memorials and monuments stood out to me. What did I remember about those places I lived? And per each place, I could come up with a monument that pretty immediately that sort of spoke to those cultures. Maybe not incredibly directly, but in my own personal experience, ones that were memorable. And I won't get into each one of these, but there were definitely expressions of that sort of collective memory and being a united culture. And then it wasn't until a little later that I came to move to the United States. And I had a pretty immediate reaction or understanding that there was a difference there in terms of the cultures. And I'm not knocking America in that sense, but it was definitely different. The cultural proclivities of being a little more spread out and individual and autonomous, so that that sort of festive public life wasn't there in the same way when I moved to the United States. And I also was thinking about monuments that I could remember that were sort of notable to me. It took some thinking, and it wasn't until I came to move to Washington, D.C. after graduating that really I could fall into a memory of something that was very notable, and that's the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall amongst all the monuments. This one I would say is my favorite and remains so because it does carry with it this understanding of civic life in the United States and commemorating something that is valuable to us. So that this is sort of a touchstone for me in thinking about the importance of monuments. So this basic question was one that allowed me to kind of move forward, and one that I would pose hypothetically to everybody. Would almost be inclined to ask for a show of hands as to who thinks that civic arts, monuments, and memorials are essential. Not just valuable, but that they are actually essential, something that we need. And this is a question that arose out of recent events and discussions about monuments and memorials in our civic realm, what they represent and what they can bring people to, and a wide variety of action. So this is obviously topical, and I felt like this is the essential question to ask about monuments and memorials, and again, helped me to move forward. There are also a variety of opinions about it. The ones that mainly had generated thoughts in my own mind were those that were proposing that monuments didn't carry the value that I see that they have, whether it's to take them all away or just to not really pay as much attention to them, and kind of thinking of them as non-essential. So in understanding that question, before we can really move forward, it is important to sort of cover the bases here. And maybe this is Civic Art 101, but I think still important to just at least go over the basic essence and the definitions of each of these terms. Civic art really kind of being a bit difficult to find a direct definition for, but the idea of civic relating to the citizen, I found that this word civicus actually refers to a crown that was awarded to a Roman citizen if they saved another Roman citizen's life. So it's looking out for each other in that very specific sense. An art I use as a different kind of definition by saying truth liberated from experience. So those two things come together and form this idea of what it means to be civic art. And just a quote below here, I won't read it, but it really speaks well about how we might view the city, the civic realm, and what the civic art within that realm can be understood in context, is those beautiful pieces of art that occupy that area in our lives. And then making the case for civic art. This probably won't be unfamiliar to most people here in terms of thinking of civic art as a projection of architecture. So if we agree that architecture, which is beyond mere building and has a value as a cultural transmittance of values, and that it transcends basic building, then you can just project forward civic art as something that carries that forward with the Vitruvian triad of firmness, commodity, and delight, that it would be there and lasting, that it would serve a purpose, and that it has that ability to cause delight in us as citizens. So then moving on to monuments and memorials. This one was interesting to think about because I hadn't really posed the question to myself, honestly. I kind of conflated the two terms, memorial and monument, but really there are some essential differences between them, and some ideas to think about before specifically defining them. Both of them do reference memory, so that's what they share in common, both individual and collective. And then there's this term commemorating, which is basically the act of translation of individual experiences as it relates to a community. That equals commemoration. It can be an event or an effort where people act through a shared set of ideas about the past. And it can really most often be a response to something profound like a war. We fought nobly in the war. So it's a very strong feeling based on an event. So the basic definitions being that monuments really distilled are the physical embodiment of commemoration. It can be a statue, a building, but it's of the sort of architectural world, if you will. And they typically commemorate a famous or notable person or event. Basic examples of that would be Washington Monument or Triumphal Arches. And that there's this collective memory that's involved. It involves other people. A memorial, on the other hand, can be just an individual memory and can apply to pretty much anything. As you see in these images on the bottom of the screen, it can be a tombstone, commemorative coins, a highway, a stadium, a book. And there are definitely monuments that can be memorials at the same time. Lincoln would be an example of that. Then I move into some focus on our country and its relationship with monuments and memorials, but sort of stepping back to touch on something I brought up earlier, and that is the part of the identity of our nation as one that is very much private as opposed to public. And I make those contrasts with those cultures I was talking about at the beginning, where I would say that those cultures have a better handle on the collective versus the individual. This gets into one of the papers or commentary pieces that I wrote, and discussing the idea of distance and difference as being a cause for issues that are happening today, and things that keep us from being more united. So this idea of our own private quality, I think, is pertinent here. And I think most people would understand that in other cultures, the whole idea of private is kind of foreign. I mean, the word might be in the language, but it's not really used and thought of in the same way that we do. We sort of elevate that as of a particular value, and not to say that that's not good, but it does have the ability to keep us at a distance if it's not mitigated, I would say. So yeah, that adds up to not being able to have a shared set of ideas about a past, present, or future. It also it doesn't compel us to hold each other accountable. We stay out of each other's business and kind of let things go, whereas one might think about it in terms of being on some level guilty if you don't correct or try to improve other people. So this is an essential difference between those cultures, and I think helpful to understand in terms of the potential for improvement, that we're in it together and that we should think about it that way. I also looked at U.S. History of Commemoration. I won't get into this too much. It's interesting information, but it does a good job of setting the table for how we might think about commemorating in the future. And I found it interesting that at the beginning of our country, in our origin story, the founders didn't really like the idea of commemorating. They essentially objected to that act because they felt like that was a risk in terms of emulating the British aristocracy that we came from. And so they thought it might be a corrosive agent. In the end, we ended up commemorating, obviously, but that was the initial posture towards this act. And then generally the history of commemoration can be traced back through Europe into the Middle Ages, and the idea of going on pilgrimages to visit and revere relics from saints. And that was in the Middle Ages, then taken forward into more secular realms of basically collecting various artifacts and using them as a means to remember and to have acquired knowledge. Giulio Camilo's concept of the memory theater is a good example of that in the Renaissance. So that basically traveled through Europe to North America, and then ultimately we embraced commemoration because we were a new nation and needed to come up with some national identity, which happens in cultures. Whenever there's a rupture in history, there's a tendency to want to build on and project your narrative in your identity. So I actually used the comparison of monuments and memorials as a way, and civic art as a way to take one of those things and move them forward. And so I essentially said monuments are more important because they hold within them the capacity to be civic, to be collective, and therefore more impactful. Whereas memorials can just be individual, and civic arts is sort of a general term for all of these things. So in my research, I have been looking into the particulars of monuments and their narratives. I'm looking at the different types and characteristics on some level, attempting to create parallels to understand the essence of each type of monument, which is a pretty big task, and sort of just scratching the surface here. But in my investigations, I sort of adopted this taxonomy to help categorize these different types, and basically broken down to a building, an object, and a human figure. There are others, but I've found that they fit underneath those categories pretty well. So I'll go, this will be, again, sort of the Monuments 101, so I won't spend too much time on it. Most people know what these things are, but I tried to take some exemplary models here to just look at briefly. Under the building category, we have temple, which per Carol William Westfall's categorizations of typology, or his thoughts on typology, follows in that that same consideration of temples being celebratory, and the tholos being about veneration in its various forms. Monumental buildings that are iconic and can contain either of those things, but are then obviously used, but also commemorative at the same time. The sort of one note obelisk and column, pretty straightforward, obvious symbolism there. And again, the parallel nature of this is interesting to me, in particular with these first, more simple, iconic forms of monuments, the obelisk, the column, and the arches. I find that those are pretty broad and universal, and I've found a lot of different examples of each in all stretches of the planet. And I haven't shown too much here because I don't have the capacity to do that. But I have found a great wealth of diversity there. Object is tower. And while I'm scrolling through these, I'll say that there's been, I've had some takeaways from this, observations about what monuments, what monuments best serve certain causes, so that there are particular connections between them, some for obvious reasons, and then more subtle. The cenotaph is an interesting one in that it is one of the more memorial type monuments. In other words, it's very much about a specific individual, but then can cross over into the realm of monument because it's celebrated by many. But the form itself as a tombstone, as an example, is part of that language of individual memorial. Theaters and precinct walls. The fountain. I've heard a little bit about the design project that I believe the juniors are doing. I think it is in Italy, in Rome, maybe. So I imagine this type of monument is being looked at pretty carefully, but very notable for the obvious organic nature of it, the dynamism of water that can contribute to the reading of the monument, the power of it. And then into figures, my take on these particular monuments is that they're sort of high risk, high reward, is I guess I would put it. Anyway, starting from the largest here, the colossal figure, the colossal statue. I had a lot of those. And I think the reason behind it is because a variety of cultures, when they're celebrating something that is as large as, say, a deity or just a human figure that comes close to a deity, the basic thought is the bigger the better. And then down in scale, the noble historic statue. And then the noble allegoric. Relief sculptures, very much tied into the ability to tell a narrative with the different figures almost being wanting to come out of a plane, but still basically being on a sheet. Here I wanted to show this one. It's a new memorial that's being, or monument that's being built in Washington, D.C., the World War I Memorial. It's essentially sculpture, and these sculptures designed and made by my brother by another mother, Sabine Howard, who's an exceptional artist. You can see his work here. And the process, in some ways, just as fascinating as the final result. Really pretty amazing. More relief in different ways. And then somewhat at the end here, the all-in monument that has a little bit of everything. And some funiments. Can't leave these out. The gentleman on the far left is commemorating profound indifference across the ages. The lady on the upper right is our collective fall from grace. And the horses on the bottom is the exodus of equestrian statues from their noble heroes. So I've culled information from examining a lot of these, this parallel, excuse me, of all of these monuments. And I've attempted to lay out a list of the key ingredients for a successful monument based on these findings. And I've got a 12-point list here. We don't have to get too much into detail on it, but I was picking up on certain things that were definitely there as an idea to say, once you've extracted it, per precedence and analysis, that you could then use it for your own design. And I'll just go through it quickly. Monumentalism, that it has some sort of presence. Memorability, that it has the ability to stick in your brain. Durability, obviously has to last if it wants to convey meaning over time. Beauty, that has that ability to transcend and to take you into a different place that a basic building doesn't, something that is more sacred. Legible, that an individual can understand it without being told or reading a sign. And that can be obvious, but also subtle. Universal and timeless, that it does speak to the community that it represents and is commemorating, but also that it lasts and has that excellence that ties it to a broader family of memorials and monuments. Profound meaning, the content, that it be of a certain substance that matches the calling to be a monument. Authenticity, that it really connect to those specific circumstances that it's being designed for. And honorability, that there is a quality of sort of uplifting, of trying to bring a value of care, even if it's in a tragic circumstance. Provocativeness and inspiration, that it arrests the attention through evocation and narrative to inspire human spirit and intellect. And the last two here, commemoration, speaks truthfully on behalf of the collective with a shared set of ideas about the past. And finally, civility, that has is respectful of its relative place in the civic realm, both in appearance, decorum, and content. And it acts to positively form the public as a work of civic art. So then I took some of those, a building, an object, and a statue that I thought best exemplified or met this criteria, just to kind of test the theory, as it were. And these ones you see here, I think succeed in that regard. And then what I like to do is just show you, I'll put my own hat in the ring here and see how they match up to that same criteria, just to walk you through some of those designs, and I won't spend too much time on it. But just to show you sort of my thought process, my design process, and utilizing that same knowledge to create something that is hopefully successful and commemorates in a positive way. The first one here is a monument for President Eisenhower. This was actually a counter proposal sponsored by the National Civic Art Society. I put a design in for a counter proposal to the Frank Gehry design, which is currently built. And I'll show you some images of that. And I put these in here. It is an intentional critique of the design without getting into it, but it would say that this design doesn't meet that 12-point criteria. Though there are aspects of it that can be nice. Here's what it has been built as fairly recently. And here's my proposal that was much more modest, I would say, in terms of the overall scope of it, and tried to compress to be a noble monument as an object. There are multiple objects here, but I proposed that the site be treated in a particular way. In the end, there were two sculptures of Eisenhower as an educator and as a family man, and then an American flag. And then ultimately, the main monument, or the focal point, was this pentagonal triumphal arch. And this was, I'm not trying to make excuses for myself, but this is a fairly quick project. Call it a weekend kind of thing. But I felt like it was something that was worth putting out there to say you don't have to design a whole complex in a particularly illiterate way, but that you could use the power of these symbols and the richness of this language to express an honorific monument for this president who did a lot in terms of our domestic policy, but also foreign and civil rights. The next one here is the National Native American Veterans Memorial, put on by the Smithsonian Institute. This one was particularly interesting, just given the subject matter. The Native American culture is so rich, so I had a lot to delve into. But it is a monument that's most meant to honor those that fought, any Native Americans that fought for the country, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian. So it is those three groups that were meant to be honored with this memorial, this monument. And as I said, there was a lot of richness there that I could draw from as inspiration for these designs. I saw a lot of sort of cosmic reference, a lot of circles, and this was sort of across the board with any one of these particular cultures. But taking those cues, excuse me, oops. I put forward this design here. I think that's, oh, I skipped one. At least looking at the site plan, the building on the left, the larger white object is the main museum there, and the proposed site for the monument I put right on the edge in front of the museum, or across from the main museum there, straddling that plaza and the native planting area just to the east of it, with an idea that it sort of bridges the two worlds and ties into nature, which is a large part of the cultural traditions within each one of them. And also looking at the particular forms that I found across the board helped to inspire the floor plan that I put together, which is essentially that tholos. And I have three appendages to that add up and sort of intertwine together. One of my sort of symbolic gestures was that the Native American warriors, whenever they were done fighting, they would come back and do a dance, a celebratory dance, sacred dance, post-war. When they were fighting for the United States, they actually were, that was banned. They weren't allowed to do that. And so this was sort of a reference to that, that when they came back, they would symbolically have that opportunity. And I had finished the design for this. I just submitted it, actually showed my children, and without skipping a beat, one of them said, "It looks like a fidget spinner," the plan of the building up here. And as soon as they said that, it just kind of destroyed it for me. I couldn't get it out of my head. Oh well, I tried. But you don't have to look at the plan. The elevation itself did take a lot of cues from the existing museum. But again, looking at other types of architecture within that tradition, particularly the dome and the centralized spaces, other symbolism, using the leaves here as acroteria, and further down you can even see the little goutte, which are tail feathers of a bird. On center, the symbol of the eagle as freedom. The drum up above as this headband motif, and working up to the top, these broken arrows surrounding the oculus represent peace. And looking at section, it shows you some of the more direct tie-ins to this cosmic relationship. In this case, a cosmic tree. Again, the associations with nature are very strong, so I wanted to include that, and also some gestures towards the vernacular nature, while still being formal. And ultimately, this oculus in the shape of a star would bring in some pretty dramatic light, which is part of the sacred nature of the experience in a place like this that's intended for veneration. Some of these images here are trophies of war, which was a big part of their war culture. And here's the award-winning submission, the design that will be built by somebody else. The next one, I think I'll kind of skip through. I'm checking my time here. This was another one that I've worked on as an intern, and looks to happen across from the National Museum of African History. And this is the National Liberty Fund Memorial. But I'll kind of go through that one to get to the Freedmen's and Contraband's Memorial. This is the one that Father Billeen referenced. This is the project that I was the winning submission for, which honors, sort of brings back the history of this group of people. The Contrabands and Freedmen named that because they escaped slavery and came as far north as Alexandria, where they could be free. They established a community there, and this became their grave site, which got forgotten and built over with a gas station. Ultimately, an archaeologist found this, and then the city of Alexandria put this competition together. But it's a very powerful site in the history of Alexandria, where I live. And I put forward this proposal, which is very modest. I actually had to hold back and wanted really to be contextual and deferential to the community there. And so it ended up winning, and I got signed on as a consultant to do some further designs. But essentially, it's recasting this lot as cemetery. And you can see some of the components there, the gate. This structure was meant to allude to a chapel, and then it had a sculptural piece to that. And in further designs, I had looked at ways to enrich that and to bring some more symbolism into that and being more memorable in that sense. Looking at some more classical motifs, but also this sculptural element itself. I was interested in the idea of having these United States colored troops play a role in being these telemon for a symbolic casket for all those that were buried there. And I got into the symbolism a bit there and felt that that was an interesting or a great opportunity to try and do that. Got a little literal with it, making associations with Alexandria, as in Virginia, but with Alexandria, Egypt, looking at the papyrus and lotus capitals as a possibility, and obelisks on top of that. But I was trying to sort of push the bounds on some level. And this is what ultimately got built. It was designed, it was handled by a large architecture firm, and I was the consultant, and they kind of took liberties with that and made it something else. I think it was still successful in some ways. Definitely different, but there's a very abstract sculptural piece there that's the main focal point. Very emotive in that sense, and powerful, but a little different than the tradition of statue making that I showed previously. Part of that proposal I had suggested would be to have a counter monument to what's called the Appomattox statue in Alexandria that's since been taken down. It's a Confederate soldier that faces south and has a certain mood of defeat. And this, in the upper left, this was my counter to that, with a United States colored troop there in discussion with the Confederate soldier. And then the last thing I'll show here is something that you're probably familiar with, and that is my proposal for Monument Ave, as a response to obviously what's been going on recently with the Confederate statues and beyond. Where is at this particular location a very strong emphasis on the narrative of the lost cause of the Civil War, with all of those figures marching down Monument Ave, with the exception of Arthur Ashe, obviously, is something of a counter proposal. And this image sort of speaks for itself, but an attempt to balance two things, and that is understand that the narrative of some commemoration is ultimately not commemorative, in that it doesn't bring in the people, the public that it ought to represent, but also a way to do that in a civil manner. So that was part of this proposal here on the right, to show different ways to deal with the issue in a nuanced and civil way. And then ultimately a proposal that I made for this theater of memory. When I see it, I can immediately be critical of it, but the idea is that it's meant to be more representative while also maintaining a sense of identity, which is something that I'd like to get into. Excuse me. So then I put myself out there and say, how did I do with any of these monuments? Did I succeed in making these successful monuments? And I won't cull through these. I'll let you think about it. But that was my attempt, anyways, to try to meet these demands. And so to sum up, I would basically distill that list to three elements that I think make monuments essential, and that is identity, beauty, and unity. Identity is a pretty big part of this, and one that I hadn't really thought about in specific terms. But human beings are definitely part of a narrative and want to be part of a narrative. We want to be part of a story, and memory has a very big role to play in that. It allows us to see who we are in the context of our world and to understand ourselves. And I had read up on some really interesting information about just that thing, that our identities are tied to this ability to remember and be impacted by narrative. The neurosciences are showing that to be empirically true, and that there's that direct connection between our brains and narratives that we seek out. So then the next question for me is, if that's true, then that's something we need to respond to. And that as architects and urban designers, you have to think about what are the two main conveyors of that. One is human beings for obvious reasons, but then it's our built environment, which is sort of the next element that we are in direct contact with, and then even more so monuments, because they're sort of representatives of ourselves, especially statues. So they carry that potential, and again, it's going to be good, bad, and ugly. They can have an impact in a variety of ways. Not all is going to be good, so that needs to be acknowledged. But that we're always looking for it, that says something. So monuments and memorials add to our narrative. That utilitarian argument of allowing for no harm by not having them at all does have the impact of denying identity. So I think that's something that should be taken with caution. And then I would invite everybody to try this hypothetical exercise of imagining the National Mall, for example, without any monuments. And for me, my reaction to that hypothetical isn't that there are a lack of beautiful things, but more that there's a lack of identity in a sense, waking up with amnesia. It's that same kind of feeling that's eerie and a little scary. The last 2 points I'll just spend a little time on is of beauty and unity. Beauty, I've suggested in other ways, is basically useless. I think it's, I'm just not trying to be harsh on beauty, but just to make a point that monuments and things that are beautiful don't really do anything, but that their value is more in that it's an elevated value that takes us to places where the mundane cannot. So it's a value in that standpoint. And I think it's interesting to touch back to what I would call the origin of commemorating in the United States, which is these relics in the Middle Ages, and the idea that we Catholics or Christians who engage with relics wouldn't worship the relic, but rather they would honor and adore it, understanding that it's more of a conduit to the saint that it comes from. So it is that transcendent thing that allows for that connection, and memorials and monuments can be thought of in that same way, where they take us out of the world and propose transcendent ideas about what it is to be a good person and a civil person. And then finally, unity. We're social creatures, and in order to realize our full potential, it behooves us to know that we're in it together. We are our brother and sisters keepers, and that in the architectural realm, it's appearing to me to be that monuments are the best way to do that of all the elements in architecture and urbanism. So in conclusion, if those things are true, if those three things are indeed true, We might conclude that civic art, monuments, and memorials are not just valuable, but essential to flourishing as human beings. And we as architects have the responsibility to address this human need for identity, beauty, and unity in responsible ways. So civic art can help us be better, and it can provide a powerful visual expression and remind us about what we want to be through example. And this doesn't mean that all efforts of commemoration are correct. We are human and err, so there should be a realistic expectation for monuments as well. We cannot expect utopia or perfection, yet we should pursue correction where and when possible and have hope that we can succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CJ. Thank you very much. Are there any questions, Mary Beth?
Yes, we have a question from Professor David Marinick. Just 1 second, I'm going to ask if Professor Marinick would like to read his question himself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, CJ.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm doing well. Congratulations on your talk.
Thank you very much.
I want to make an observation, and I would like you to comment on it. It's that we in society are shaped as much by what we choose to forget as what we choose to remember. The Romans practiced what was later called damnatio memoriae, so essentially the canceling out of memories, like Nero's Golden House. You know, the lake of Nero's Golden House, it becomes the site of the Colosseum, specifically to put a public monument in place of a private one. There's no memorial to Remus. The church for centuries canceled out pagan culture to proclaim the triumph of the faith. I mean, a lot of pagan buildings were cannibalized to make Christian churches. So that's what I'd like you to comment on, is the fact that the nature of forgetting is as much a part of the memorial process as the actual choosing to remember something.
Thank you. Great question, of course. I have been thinking about that and understand that that's a big part of it, and it has to be. The context, I guess, of my response would be that it is the balancing of those two things as opposed to the exclusion of one. I've been proposing the positive here, that is that we keep things and haven't really been representing what you just stated. I think that, I guess I would point to the proposal that I had for Monument Ave, and that is that some things need to be corrected. The decision on how and what should be corrected is a really fun process of politics. But I completely agree that careful forgetfulness is also part of the equation necessarily. And I guess I'm only being a proponent of not forgetting altogether, if that makes any sense. So there obviously have been great conversations about what to do with the Confederate memorials. But it seems to me the critical part of that is the how and the who makes that decision as being a representative of what that narrative should be, right? Like if the wrong people and the wrong forces set that narrative, then it ends up being false. Hopefully I answered that a little bit.
We have another question coming in from Julio Cesar Perez Hernandez, another one of our faculty members. JC, you can unmute and speak now.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Julio Cesar. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. It's eye-opening in many regards, and I appreciate your vision about the monuments and memorials, etc. Our fourth-year students and we faculty are embracing a new project in Richmond very soon, 2 weeks from today.
Oh, really?
and it's in a way a counter proposal for the one that has already been approved. So I would kindly appreciate if you please can provide your advice for us, students and faculty, in that regard.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read the question also, just so I can see it. Can I ask a question about the nature? I'm not familiar with that project, the museum in Richmond, as a counter proposal. What is it?
Well, one of our professors, the main professor in charge of the fourth-year program, Professor John Mellor, was informed about this by our colleague in Richmond, Carol William Westford.
Yeah.
And so there was a possibility for our school to embrace a project, taking a look at that specifically at these very times. And so it has become the second project for our fourth-year students. So I believe that your advice would be very much appreciated by everybody, but especially for by our students and our professors.
Sure. Is it have anything to do with, I guess, issues of race?
Yes, race and slavery and all that.
Okay, that's the museum. I got you. Yeah, that's very obviously sensitive, given Richmond's history and the people that are part of that city. I think Carol William Westfall would have a good idea of more of the inner workings there. But in general, I would suggest that it might be an unpopular position here, but I would suggest that this possibly be taken as an opportunity to understand, sort of dig into the city a bit more in terms of its racial past, and in terms of advice for the students. I would continue to echo my tones, my undertones or overtones of unity, in trying to, I don't know how much you could possibly engage, but not just come at it from one side, I guess is what I'm saying, to the degree that that's possible. But also sort of harnessing the power of being able to represent the underrepresented. So I think I'm maybe sounding a little bit vague here, but a museum project like this would be pretty powerful, impactful, if they could find a way to bring in some reconciliation. And I don't know specifically how that happens, but beyond just a museum, I guess the way I think about it is the circle that I had proposed on Richmond Ave. It's almost like a museum in the public realm. And to me, that was an exciting proposal to say, we're just bringing it right up front. Let's have this conversation. So maybe in the same way that posture could be utilized for this museum, and that the students could think from that direction. It sounds like a great project.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
CJ, we have a couple of questions from students that I'm going to read. Can I ask you to stop screen sharing just so we can see your
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So our first question, and Joyce, I tried to get you on mute to ask it yourself, but it's from one of our students named Joyce. And it goes along with something you were just saying to JC, that how do you go about creating a respectful monument for an underrepresented culture like Native Americans? Do you consult the Native groups for their input or feelings about certain symbols being portrayed in the monument?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I guess I think of the answer is, of course, yes, you would consult them and learn as much as you can. And in that same breath or response, I would say this is true for all of architecture. When you have a client, is you're also acting as an expert. So you have an understanding about what architecture can do and how certain things can come off. So I would say having all the information on the table is definitely key, and you'll learn things that you couldn't possibly have learned outside of that process of dialogue with the client and those particular people that you're commemorating and representing. And that's what I did, just dig in, research kind of stuff. And then yes, conversation as well to the degree that you can. But then also think of yourself as a proactive player in that, and in terms of your ideas, and trying to wield the power of architecture to the degree that we can. It doesn't, I don't believe it changes too much, but it can be used to great effect. So I think when you combine those two things, yeah, it can result in something pretty powerful. But yeah, to be honest, that's the best part of it to me is understanding where people are coming from and the sort of richness that's involved with your quote unquote client. So I would, yeah, I guess I would leave you with that, is to say, really embrace that process.
Thank you. We have another question from another student. Naomi has asked me to read it. She wants to know what you think should be done with memorials and monuments that are no longer appropriate. And can you go into more detail about the counter monument at the Alexandria Memorial?
Sure. So I've got a lot of my thoughts come out in that one diagram that I had at Monument Ave, where it's being responsive, not having a one size fits all. And they're probably, even within saying that they're these disagreeable monuments, some may be more disagreeable than others. And so taking it case by case, let's say hypothetically it's the worst, the one that nobody wants out there. Then that one, as a hypothetical, per Professor Mayernick's history of what had happened in Rome, is that it go away, and that you can put it put it away in a good way or a bad way. And a museum seems to be a pretty appropriate one. All sorts of things are acceptable in a museum. And so that tends to be the right answer for most of that. Then going into my counter proposal in Alexandria, that was interesting because it wasn't in the program. That was something that I added in there. Because as I said, I live in Alexandria. I was very familiar with this monument, this Confederate soldier. And it's funny because my reaction was never one of outrage or anything like that. Honestly, it was a little bit, it's a sad statue and you sort of feel sorry for it, or him, or whatever. So I, at that moment, was interested in the idea of at least engaging, and thought it would be a very great opportunity to do that. The statue itself is in the middle of the parkway that leads all the way down to George Washington's house. So on some level, people just don't like it because it's a traffic hazard. So I had thought to maybe put it right in the middle and just be very bold in that sense, but almost from that pragmatic standpoint, didn't want to. That's why you see it off to the side. But that's not unusual. That particular statue in a lot of cities in Virginia. So I felt like it was at least polemically a good move to bring some attention to it by putting a counter proposal out there. Thank you. Very good questions.
We're back to a faculty question again. Al DeFries, I think, is going to ask verbally.
Okay.
Hi, CJ.
Hello.
Very good lecture. This really is very, thought-provoking. I had two experiences that I didn't get to Washington, D.C. until my adult life. And I didn't have much time to see a lot of things because I was there on business. And so, but I did cross the Potomac from Arlington, and the first place I went to was the Lincoln Memorial. And that had such a profound impact on me, just the emotion of it. And I realized that it was most likely because of the history that I had witnessed on television,
Oh, yeah.
Martin Luther King,
Yeah.
Vietnam protests, all the other things. And then went to the Vietnam War Memorial after that. And that was even more compelling. It was, I have no friends or family that died in Vietnam. But the memorial was, I think, the best memorial I have ever seen. And then I went to the World War II Memorial and then the Washington Monument, and I was left completely flat. And so I wondered, is it what has happened with that at the Vietnam Memorial? One of the things that made it really poignant were the little flowers and little memorabilia that were left at the base for those that people loved. And but in both cases, in Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam Memorial, there's a purity and there is a simplicity to the design that makes them so powerful. Of course, you could say the Washington Monument is pretty simple too, but it doesn't have the memory. What do you think about how do we make these monuments important by the rituals we perform or the actions we associate with them?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. This is very complicated. I agree with what you're saying in terms of the events, the associations, the memories, how that can certainly play a part and should. And on some level, you would think that the design is so well that it fosters that it brought it on. But it's an inclusive endeavor in terms of the critical aspects of a monument. That if you can bring, maybe not all 12 of those points I'm talking about, but a good amount of them, that's ultimately what you come up with. So it's the thing that object that is memorable. It's the subject matter. It's noble. It has a presence, and it's all these things that make. Let's kind of parse them out and say that's what makes Lincoln successful. What makes the Vietnam War Memorial, I would say, hangs on probably like one or two things, and you named them, and that is what people bring to the table there, and I think what I would call a corrective mood, and that is one of understanding that the Vietnam Memorial, in this, the opinion of this generation and the designer, was one you couldn't really honor. So it's just about tragedy. That scar in the earth is just, we've got so much we're lifting up. Let's just acknowledge that some really bad stuff just happened, and we'll sort of feed into that pain. And so there you have that monument. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought your proposals could evoke that same kind of personal, emotional feeling.
Yeah.
Whereas Frank Gehry's, I think, totally falls flat.
Yeah, agreed. Emotion. It's a big part about emotion. But yeah, Frank Gehry's couldn't elicit the emotion that Maya Lin does with the Vietnam Memorial. And I think that has to do with design. When you're in that pit, you're feeling a different way. And that, by the way, is a different way of memorializing. You know, the classical traditional world doesn't really do that. Though it can, you know, like the cenotaph, the Lutyens cenotaph has got a somber mood to it, but it's not quite as digging as the Vietnam. So emotion has a lot to do with it, and it's kind of the part of our culture, as opposed to the culture that developed or designed our classical monuments that we know of. But yeah, it's hard to put all those things together. You know, the Washington Monument, it's simple. It's, you know, it's got all those other things. So why is it not doing those things you're talking about? And it's hard to say, you know, in a sort of collective response why. But I think you can look at each one of them, and maybe that's my big point here, is that each one does something a little different and is successful for different reasons. And we look to monuments to do different things. So I wouldn't look to the Washington Monument to give me the response, if we think of them as talking and speaking, the response that the Vietnam Memorial does, and so on. So it's certainly complex and nuanced, and I think the end result would be that we focus on assuring that they're successful. And yes, you're right, the Frank Gehry one, I agree, is not successful. So why is it not successful? And just that's kind of what we're trying to get at with distilling the criteria here, to be able to say why it is or is not successful.
Thank you. For all the students, especially who maybe didn't follow along with the long saga of the Eisenhower Memorial and the Frank Gehry design, just so you all know, it debuted, I guess was formally unveiled or dedicated or opened in some way last week. So there are plenty of current articles out there if any of you want to track down the history of that project. For now, we have a question, an alum, Alice Arn. Alice, are you there?
I am. Hi, CJ. Can you hear me?
Hi, Alice. Yeah, I can hear you.
It's nice to see you and hear from you. It's a great
Likewise.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how, kind of in what way civic engagement plays into this in creating things that aren't just beautiful and kind of meet the criteria you've talked about, but also creating things that people can love, so that kind of helps with our current problem that people are not quite as engaged in the civic realm in any way, let alone with monuments and memorials. And so what can memorial competitions or any other kind of tactic, what can we do to create things that people love and feel invested in now, but also into the future?
When you say invested in monuments themselves that we can love?
Yeah, just whether it be by involving people in the process or holding competitions, or just how do we kind of get the whole country invested in this and not just a design community?
Yeah, right. No, that's a great point. And it wouldn't have an easy or satisfying answer, just because we are such a big country that has certain qualities, as I tried to articulate a little bit, in terms of us already being a little bit detached, and I think continually getting more detached and separated. I think that's the trajectory. So it'd be in some ways sort of helping to stop that trajectory a little bit. But this is a way that could do that. That's, I guess, the proposal, that monuments could, it'd be that much, not a whole lot, but it would have the ability to do that. And in terms of creating that that response of people loving a monument or monuments, in terms of investing in them, I think that more of them would be one way to think about it. in that I guess I would go back to my beginning. The cultures that make these monuments are cultures that know how to love. And that gets played out in this reciprocal relationship with the civic realm. So we don't, I'm being critical here, we don't have a great civic realm. It's hard for me to find a place to imagine that sort of love happening. So it's really not there in the first place. So great urbanism allows for that that platform to put the monument on that then, you know, could have this sort of cyclical or reciprocal relationship, and then therefore the effect of this love of the monument. I think that's a great word that you used, and one that I think would be a good selling point, not to make it sound cheap, but I think project out, and a lot of making something successful is getting the word out, so to speak. So if we as a community, architecture and urbanism, promoted monuments in a particular way, I think that would help, you know, in terms of what we can do. The competition stuff is pretty one-dimensional and doesn't really get across the point of the essential quality of monuments. So I think as a broader body, if we pushed that, it would be meaningful.
Thank you. We have Alice, did you have a follow-up?
No, that was great. Thank you, CJ.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to hear from you.
We have a question coming in on the chat from Juan, and he is asking about the Columbus Murals, and I'm gonna jump in here. He's asking for a status update from either you, CJ, if you want to address the Columbus Murals in the main building, but I want to give a little quick status update on them. And an email that Father Jenkins sent last month, I think he did provide a status update for the campus. He has said that the coverings of the, so I think they're going to cover them with silk panels, that is supposed to be installed by the end of September. So they're running up on the deadline right now. And that shortly after that, there would be an exhibit added to the main building to kind of give some context, some history for them, but they will not be on public display, should be by the end of this month. The follow-up question from Juan on that you might want to address, CJ, it's up to you, do you think there would be a way to keep them where they are, considering they were part of the interior architecture, and sort of what difference does that make versus something that's a standalone monument?
Yeah, so I think I understand, like public versus private. The fact that it's inside is arguably less offensive or not as much of an issue because it's not open for public viewing. I would say that I err on the side of there's a line, I think, excuse me, a line of appropriateness. And I think that line can be pushed back to an appreciable degree when you contextualize. So I think you can let something remain. In other words, if you add something to it to help it be more palatable. If it isn't, then maybe something else needs to happen. But to the basic question of, even if you didn't contextualize whether it's more okay to have it inside or private versus public, I would say that if it is on the public side of things, that it is less of an issue. Again, I would be a proponent for contextualizing, but in large part what I've been speaking about is these monuments that are public, and that's where the issue comes, is that you're commemorating something that isn't representative of the broader public, which should be as inclusive as possible. But on a more private level, less of an issue, if I can just say that generally. I understand the sort of value in feeling like you should correct for whether it's private or public, but I think it's definitely less of an issue for the Columbus mural. Yep, fine.
This business of the Columbus murals came at a meeting between Father Jenkins and the Holy Cross Religious on campus a couple of years ago. And my suggestion was that they remain in place, but that tapestries, because the conceit of those paintings is that they are tapestries, so that real tapestries be woven, and we can use computer-driven looms to make that happen, to cover them, so they'll remain, but they won't be ordinarily visible. But for some sort of historical symposium or lecture, they'd still be there. But for, as far as the public goes, they would see another set of tapestries hung in front of them. Okay. I have no idea what program they chose for those tapestries. So the short answer is they'll stay there, but they will only be visible on rare occasions.
Okay.
Part of that.
We do have a question from Duncan Stroik. He has asked why you're so drawn to monuments and memorials, and how can architects bring these ideas into the design of actual buildings?
Okay, thank you. Very good questions. Thank you, Duncan. The first question is, why am I so interested? My own narrative kind of draws me there. One of the easy answers is I live in Washington, D.C., and I've been exposed to them, and I've been a part of this process as a professional and now as a professor. So there's that direct connection. But personally, I've always found them to be, in my narrative, found them to be very curious. And there's, I think, an obvious reason for that. There's such a concentrated, there's such a concentrated source of meaning, good, bad, ugly, again, whatever. But they always had, there's so much invested in them that I think they sort of call out for attention. And for me, for whatever reason, I've been really interested in narratives and culture. And I think a part of that has to do with moving around and witnessing different cultures. And so the architectural version of them is pretty neat to me. So that's my personal response. The other part of that question is, I might need some help remembering, it is how to bring them into the architecture, like some of those principles into architecture.
Yes.
And maybe you saw in some of those examples, like the relief, the bas reliefs and tympanums and that sort of thing. I just acknowledge that can be part of architecture, but in a more profound sense, I think the power of rhetoric and symbolism and that sort of richness of culture definitely is wanting, I would say. That's my own opinion about it, but the way we treat architecture right now is very much a formal exercise. And if architecture is a projection of civic art, then it follows that they should receive that same investment and be imbued with meaning and that sort of thing. So the richness, so the architecture could learn from the monuments, in other words, and be improved by them.
Excellent. We have two more questions, both from faculty members, and then we'll be able to wrap up. Okay. First up is Richard Economakis.
Hello, Richard.
Hi, CJ. Thank you very much for a very enjoyable lecture. I think your designs for monuments are excellent and wish they were built. I had a question about the setting of monuments today. Obviously, for them to be appreciated, they need to be appropriately situated. And the problem today is that so many tend to be located randomly, opportunistically, without a broader sense of how they relate to the city, to the city's public spaces, and few actually are part of a larger narrative. So my question is, to what degree in your work in taking on these projects have you found that you've had to articulate an urban vision together with the monuments, your designs for the monuments? And if so, where do you stop? How do you limit them? Do you I mean, I think the Eisenhower Memorial design, I think you had actually, you actually were working within a specific context, but I don't know to what degree you extend your thinking beyond the site. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Richard. In the process of pretty much every one of those my memorial designs, monument designs, I don't actually go through with this, but I imagine the broader context and a broader scope as if I were the urban designer. Excuse me. That you wouldn't necessarily see that, but that's where I approach it from, as if I had the charge of improving the whole context. So I'll kind of put that in and take it out, and maybe it doesn't always end up to follow that master plan, if you will, but I'm always thinking about it. The reality, though, is that there's a lot of limitation per client or program about what they want, and even then I try to push it to propose what should be rather than what's prescribed. So I definitely think about it, and I agree that there's a pretty static conception of what monuments can do, and part of their power is that context, a big part of that power. So when these design proposals or these competition proposals go out there, there's a very myopic view about we've got to address this and commemorate these people, and you sort of go down the list, and it becomes a very pragmatic process, and therefore very static. So I think an understanding of that bigger context would go towards answering one of the previous questions about us caring more about these monuments and understanding them as a part of a bigger picture, and therefore being more helpful. So it does come into the designs, but ultimately it doesn't really flesh out to be much more than the specific monument that's been asked for.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from John Meller, and then we did have a student question slide in at the last minute. So we'll go with John and then the student, and then we will call it a night. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, CJ.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great.
Nice, easy one here for you. So as a classical architect, do you find the use of classical architecture to be problematic in monuments and memorials to cultures not usually associated with classical architecture?
Great question, and very topical as well. Yes, it's problematic in the sense that people see it as a problem. From my perspective, they're not problems that can't be overcome or worked around in a way. It depends on who you ask and what the context is, to be honest. You bring up the idea of colonialization or colonization in different countries where it is very much a big deal, and one that kind of stokes people to violence, to be honest with you. So being a classicist can be dangerous. But if you understand in the context of a lot of our classical architecture was foisted on or projected on cultures as being that particular application, and are able to then make a case that you could be, anything could be foisted on you. It doesn't make the actual type of architecture the enemy. So if you're able to at least make that case and not colonize it, not just throw this piece of architecture down that doesn't respond to the context part of the success of the monument, but also of architecture, where it can be sensitively employed, which makes, and honestly, it makes it better architecture when you're responding to those kinds of forces. But when you're able to make that case, and I guess that's what I tried to do in the Native American Memorial Monument that I showed you, is to say it's responding to all these things, and therefore becomes that much more unique and that much more beautiful. So in that context, not problematic for me. I'll keep going till it is clear that that can't happen. But the classical aspect of it, I don't prescribe to apologizing for it, only when it's necessary.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And now I have a question from Noah, and this should be our last one.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Sorry.
A little bit.
Okay. I was trying to make sure, given our current project, we are, as third years, designing a monument to justice. And given the current situation of society today and the injustices that are still going on, how would one design a commemoration to past justice while also staying sensitive to the current problems in society today, or not seem like we're trying to distract from the issue? Or do you believe that in commemorating the past that we can create an avenue to draw inspiration for the future?
Great question. Thank you, Noah. I absolutely agree with that last bit that you said, that you can create an avenue towards the future. The school that you're at and the one that I teach at are fortunate to be proponents of looking at the past as a rich resource, and we can get a lot from it. And in the same sense that I was responding to the last question, there are things of the past that are certainly bad, but learning from them and understanding that and being wise, therefore wise, I think is an incredibly valuable and essential part of what we do. Again, you have to be sensitive about it. And yeah, in particular with regard to justice, I think it actually is congruent with the idea of justice, and looking at the past for ways to be better. And maybe I didn't entirely understand that aspect of your question, because it is such a big, a very profound part of the conversation that's happening today. But if I didn't get it, then let me know. But I would say that we are uniquely suited to respond to this question of rising to the occasion of providing for justice based on the past, to be honest.
I think Krupali Crochet had a comment. Krupali, are you there?
Yes, it was just a comment and a thank you for your wonderful lecture, CJ.
Thank you, Krupali.
I just wanted to say that the Native American monument you had designed is very beautifully executed. In a culture where Western classical may not be the most appropriate way to describe the Native tradition, there needs to be new ways in which you define classicism. And I think your design exemplifies that. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for the lecture.
Thank you very much, Krupali. That means a lot, sincerely.
And that is the end of our questions, CJ. It's been a marathon for you. Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it. And I think you're going to be part of the reviews for the third years as well. So they are looking forward to hearing more from you then too.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to the new reviews. and to the day when you can be here on campus with us for further discussion and debate.
Yes.
Congratulations on your work and all of the insights you've given us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Applause, but it's hard to do virtually.
I'll take it. I'll assume they're there. Thank you very much. An honor to be here, and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.